Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 28, Freaked Out. This was maybe the most surreal moment of Jen's life, and considering everything she'd been through in 15 short years, that was saying quite a bit. But ordering food for her arch-nemesis, well, it was weird, and getting him the kids' meal felt oddly like revenge for all the times he'd called her a mere child. She set the box down in front of him. He frowned. Burger Shack. It sort of sounded like a question, but since she'd never had a real conversation with him before, it was hard to tell. I got you the kids' meal, so don't let them know you're over 7. She sat down at the table opposite him, her back to Gwen and Kevin. She was watching Vilgax like a hawk. Kevin snorted slightly into his burger. Gwen elbowed him. What? He asked, his mouth still full. Gwen glared. This isn't funny. Come on, her big bad worst enemy shows up and wants what? He was being sarcastic, but Vilgax didn't seem to catch it. I need your help. Gwen glared, but Jen remained silent. You shouldn't even be here. You were banished from our planet. Gwen practically snarled. Kevin grew slightly more serious. What makes you think she'll help you, Squidface? Kevin asked as he balled up the wrapper from his burger and tossed it into the garbage can. One word. He stared, leaning forward slightly. What's that? Gwen asked, sounding nearly ready to leap into battle. Ghost freak. All 3 of them froze. Vilgax smirked slightly. Jen leaned forward. What about her? Jen's voice had gone very serious. All joking air had vanished. Vilgax outlined what the escaped Omnitrix transformation had done to his world. The team was quiet for a moment after he finished speaking. Jen took a deep breath. We'll help. Gwen spluttered. Kevin frowned. Jen glanced at them, never fully taking her eyes off Vilgax. If he's telling the truth, then this is my problem to fix. Ghost Freak was one of the original 10. She's my responsibility. And if he's lying? Kevin asked. Jen's lip quirked up. Then I take him again, and this time I make sure he can't get back up. Her threat came through loud and clear, but Vilgax must have been serious because he didn't even threaten her back. Jen texted Julie to send Ship to them, not to come with him. A few minutes later, an empty moped rolled up to them, and Ship transformed back to his normal blob-like form. He leapt into Jen's arms and happily beeped. He peeked over her shoulder and hissed at Vilgax. I know, Ship. I don't like him either, but we're not doing this for him. She scratched him under his chin and for a moment before Vilgax grew impatient. What is the significance of the minuscule galvanic mechamorph? We must hurry if we are to save my people. Ship beeped at Jen. She rolled her eyes. Don't listen to him, Ship. You're very important. Battleship mode, please. Ship chirped and leapt from her arms, transforming midair forming into the large ship. Don't diss my friend's dog, Jen demanded. She gestured the others aboard. The trip to Vilgaxia, a 3-hour flight at light speed, was silent. Kevin flew the ship. Gwen kept her nose in her book, occasionally looking up to glare at Vilgax. Jen never broke eye contact with him. Gwen was sort of impressed, honestly. She rarely got to see her cousin in full hero mode outside of a fight, but she didn't really like it. It drove all the laughter from her cousin's eyes. Vilgaxia looked like it had been a lovely place, at some point. Now, though, it was covered in webs and patrols of ghost freaks. They slipped by one such patrol and were safely hidden away. When a wailing started, Vilgax tensed. He was practically shaking. What is that? Kevin asked, covering his ears. A child crying. He burst through the wall and gave chase after the patrol. I told you he couldn't be trusted, Gwen quipped, but Jen was already moving, running out of the hole, spinning the Omnitrix and transforming as she went. Vilgax hadn't been lying. A small child, a girl, by the placement of the tentacles, was sobbing on the ground, scrambling away from the advancing ghost freaks. Vilgax was fighting off most of the swarm. Save the girl! Vilgax demanded, but Jen was already there, shooting fire out of her hands, lighting up the webs above the girl. The bright light drove off the ghost freaks, and the one closest to the flames hissed and melted, leaving behind an unconscious male of Vilgax's species. Jen blinked, then shouted, "Gwen, light us up, bright as you can." Gwen began to chant. A large, bright orb appeared from her hands, and the ghost freaks shrieked and fell one by one. When the lights dimmed again, there were groaning chimera sui generis. Jen grinned as the child stood and ran, but instead of the usual hero reaction, the young girl ran to Vilgax. "Lord Vilgax, thank you!" Gwen lifted an eyebrow as Vilgax knelt in front of the girl.
"You are unhurt?"
She nodded. He smiled.
"Good. Go hide, little one."
She hugged his leg and nodded before running off. The figures on the ground seemed to be sleeping. None were dead. Jen stepped around one. Looks like Ghost Freak's old weakness still applies. Vilgax raised what passed for his eyebrow. Sunlight. Ever since she escaped the Omnitrix, she can't stand light in most forms, but sunlight works best. "Think we can work with that?" Gwen nodded. "We just need to get close." Jen nodded. "Good, I have a plan. We just need to get in close." "Can you make that happen?" she asked Vilgax.
"There's a back way into my palace. Follow me."
The three of them stepped into line behind him. Jen in the lead. Kevin stepped up next to her while Gwen kept an eye out for more patrols.
"How'd you know he was telling the truth about the kid?"
Jen shrugged. "Why lie? This is his planet. Our rules no longer apply. He's not a conqueror here. To his people, he's a hero. Admit it, I'd do the same thing in his place on Earth." That shut Kevin up as they made their way through the deserted city streets. Chapter 29. Botched. The plan had been a good one. Sneak into the throne room and use bright light to destroy Ghost Freak again, like they had a few times before. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would save the people currently under her power, and maybe they could work out a way to destroy the Ectonurite for good after that. It had been a solid plan. But they hadn't accounted for the sentry hiding in the walls. Jen was thrown into the throne room as the others fought crowds of ghost freaks. Before she could even touch the Omnitrix, both her arms were pinned. A hissing laugh echoed around the room.
"After all these years, we finally meet again."
Jen struggled as she was dragged up into the air, and the familiar face of one of her more frequent nightmares appeared in front of her. The smile was still upside down, and she struggled again as spindly claw-like hands reached out for her. She screamed as it sunk into her skin, and she felt another presence in her mind.
"It has been too long since I was whole."
Gwen heard a scream just as she finished her incantation, and the light burst from her hands. The ghost freaks around them shrieked and fell just like the ones in the street had. Vilgax ran into the throne room. Jen was on the floor, gasping for air. Kevin and Gwen skidded into the room and raced up to Jen. "Jen?
"Are you okay?"
"Never better," Jen said, but her voice wasn't the same. It was hissing, and the Omnitrix was beeping and flashing. Green lights bloomed, and Jen transformed. Gwen screamed as her cousin's head rotated a full 180 degrees on her neck until it sat upside down and stretched into Ghost Freak's. Kevin leapt back as Ghost Freak laughed loudly, as the sigil on her chest vanished under the purple of the Ectonurite.
"Oh, to be whole once again. It has been far too long."
She laughed again.
"Vilgax, lovely to see you again. Do you like what I've done with the place?"
Vilgax snarled. Kevin spoke. "Jen, snap out of it." Ghost Freak laughed again.
"Jen's not here right now."
The hissing laughter echoed around the throne room as Ghost Freak attacked. Jen was alone in the dark. She wasn't sure how she'd gotten here, but she was alone, and no one was coming for her, not this time. She was alone, and she couldn't think straight. All she could feel was fear, paralyzing and awful and all-consuming. She couldn't even cry out. She was too scared. Laughter echoed around her.
"The little hero, helpless and trapped, just how you left me all those years."
The laughter grew louder.
"Now I will destroy everything you love, and there's nothing you can do to stop me."
Gwen went flying across the room, and Kevin lunged at Ghost Freak. The ectoneurite went intangible, then she dropped the ceiling on him. Neither got back up. Ghost Freak smiled.
Now that the small fry are taken care of.
She turned to Vilgax and just dodged the swing of his sword.
Now, that's a bit unnecessary. I thought you and I got along well. After all, I may have kept rotting in that prison dear Jennifer left me in, if it wasn't for you.
Ghost Freak laughed as Gwen glared, popping her shoulder back into place. So that's how you knew what was happening with her, Vilgax growled.
And you returned my kindness by invading my world. Kindness? You are incapable of kindness. You freed me to learn how to destroy the one piece I needed to become whole again.
She laughed.
But you need not worry about that. Soon you will be part of me as well. With Jennifer Tennyson and you both under my control, I will be unstoppable.
Her cackle echoed around the throne room as Vilgax attacked. In the end, it was a close thing. Vilgax shattered his own throne. The light from the reaction of the metal of his sword with the jewels set Ghost Freak reeling just enough for the Omnitrix symbol to reappear. Ghost Freak shrieked and scrambled to hold back her own hand, which seemed to be moving on its own.
Tennyson!
She screamed as she slapped the Omnitrix. And green lights flashed again. Jen stood in the throne room, shaking from head to toe. Kevin and Gwen had pulled themselves back to their feet. You back with us? Kevin asked, trying to keep his tone light. He wasn't sure he succeeded. It was tough, knowing how easily she could take them down if she lost control. She nodded. Yeah, I think so. Jen brushed her jacket off. To clarify, that was never the plan. She glanced down at the Omnitrix, but it seemed to have worked out for the best, at least if the cheering isn't in my head. Gwen frowned, worried that her cousin might be hearing things. It wouldn't be the first time when dealing with Ghost Freak, but then she heard it too, cheering from outside Vilgax's palace. Vilgax stepped out onto the veranda, overlooking the main square of the city. It looked like it had worked. His people were celebrating their newly rediscovered freedom. Look who's Mr. Popular. Jen leaned in the doorway, just out of sight from below.
I will not accept credit for your actions.
Jen shrugged. In this case, I don't mind. What happens on Vilgaxia stays on Vilgaxia. Vilgax nodded.
This changes nothing between us. Next time I see you, I will kill you.
Jen waved him off. Yeah, I've heard it before. She turned away and stepped back into the room with Gwen and Kevin. Ship had reappeared too, and was currently showing off a new form to a perplexed Kevin who was trying to get him to stop shooting toast at him. Jen laughed. Did you learn a new trick? She asked, and Ship beeped, shooting a few pieces of oddly colored toast at her too. Good boy. Now let's go show Julie. Ship beeped and leapt into the air, turning back into his battleship form. They left, just like that, slipping out the back while the people of the world were distracted by their leader. No one noticed them leaving. Jen took the controls this time, while Gwen worked on healing herself and Kevin. That's not the way to Earth, Kevin stated. Jen nodded. I know. We're not heading to Earth. Well, we will be, just not directly. Gwen frowned. Where are we heading? Galvin Prime. Gwen frowned. Jen's knuckles were white on the controls. Are you okay? No, but I know who can fix it. The stars sped past them even faster. Chapter 30. Banished. Their landing on Galvin Prime was smoother than Kevin expected. Jen had codes that let them breeze past the security systems and land in the city itself. Ship beeped, slightly unhappy that they weren't back on Earth with Julie. It's okay, buddy. I just have something I need to take care of here. Ship beeped and leapt onto Gwen's shoulders. Come on, it's this way. Jen led them into the largest structure. It was quite impressive, and they were met at what could only be called a reception desk by a Galvin who looked them over critically. Do you have an appointment? The small amphibian asked, in an ear condescending tone. Jen rolled her eyes. I need to see Azimuth. Jen stated, Do you have an appointment? The Galvin asked again. Jen took a deep breath. Tell him, if he doesn't see me, I'll let Ghost Freak back out and let her do what she wants. The Galvan's eyes went wide, and he tapped on the keypad in front of him. Go on through. Jen nodded and gestured the others through. The Galvan at the front desk looked like he was about to argue, but shook his head. Jen heard him mutter as they went past. Pick your battles, Seraph. Pick your battles. He went back to his work as they walked through the door. They entered the lab, and Azimuth barely looked up from his workbench. Ah, Jennifer. To what do I owe this surprise? Ghost freak. That made him look up. What happened? She escaped. I've got her back in the Omnitrix, but I can feel her in my head, and I need help. Azimuth nodded and took a remote off the shelf. He pressed a button on it, and a large structure rose from the center of the floor. It looked like a large tube with a satellite dish on the top. It opened, and Jen nodded. She stepped into the device, and it closed around her. The glass clouded green, and Jen disappeared. Gwen frowned. What is that thing? This is the Genesis cradle. Kevin raised an eyebrow. How does this help? Azimuth rolled his eyes. When the cradle is active, Jen is in cryostasis, which means that none of her transformations can become active unless programmed. It will stop Ghost Freak from taking over, for a time anyway. I should be able to remove Zascare's consciousness from the Omnitrix, but I will need some outside assistance. Azimuth began to key in a few things on the pad on the outside of the cradle. Who's Zascare? Kevin asked. What can we do to help? Gwen asked. Azimuth kept working as he spoke to them. I need a trained Anodite. A fully fledged energy being would be able to find one stream of consciousness inside another and remove the invasive presence, without removing the DNA from the Omnitrix. Gwen perked up. Maybe I could... I said fully trained. You're years off being experienced enough to do this. Then it's a good thing I happen to be passing through. A new voice rang through the room, and in a flash of pink, an Anodite formed in the room. She smiled at Gwen and flew up to her. You look well, Gwen. Gwen smiled. Were you looking in on us, Grandma Verdona? The Anodite smiled. Well, I did promise I'd look in on your progress. That wasn't the whole reason. She'd been keeping an eye on her grandchildren from afar, keeping an eye on their life forces. Jen's had flickered mere hours ago, fear and pain and sorrow, then it was briefly overridden by the scummy purple film of an ectoneurite. Verdona was not a fan of the ghostly beings. She looked over the device, currently holding one of her granddaughters. It was a clever device, as all of Azimuth's devices were. It held the occupant in a deep cryostasis, but allowed for the device affixed to her wrist to be worked on and activated remotely. It could probably do much more if the rumors of the 24 planets the three had saved after the Highbreed had devastated them were true. She nodded. I'll be just a moment. She dove through the glass into the device and into Jen's mind. Gwen blinked. Okay, didn't know we could do that. Azimuth nodded. That's why you can't help her right now. Now don't touch anything. I'm going back to my work. And kindly keep your mechamorph off my experiments. Gwen nodded, and Kevin pulled up a few chairs as he yawned. Azimuth glanced at him, but returned to what he'd been working on. The cradle beeped, and Azimuth glanced at the readout. Interesting. But he refused to elaborate. The inside of Jen's mind was calm. Verdona smiled as she recognized Max's secret fishing spot. She watched from behind their tree as Jen laughed with the other members of her little team. She hadn't met the boy at Jen's side before, but they were holding hands. She shook her head. I preferred Albraxix, but... Verdona thought, but then the scene took a turn for the worse. Green lightning crackled around Kevin and left him a lifeless statue. Gwen transformed into her full Anodite form and attacked her cousin as the boy ran. Verdona frowned and stepped forward, catching Gwen's mana with ease. It wasn't really Gwen, of course. She wasn't quite skilled enough to get into someone's head like this. The false Gwen screamed as Jen scrambled to her feet. Grandma Verdona? She smiled at her granddaughter. Of course, dear. I'll be with you in just a moment. She turned back to the being squirming in her grip. Now you, Zascare. You're not welcome here anymore. Never really have been. She raised her free hand and drew several runes in the air. The ectoneurite screamed as the portal formed inside it, causing it to collapse in on itself. Jen blinked. How? What? Where did you send her? Her voice was shaking. Somewhere she won't be able to escape from. Verdona turned to her granddaughter and sat midair. Now we should talk. Jen blinked at her. I am so confused. I thought I was an azimuth lab. Oh, you are. Inside the Genesis cradle, I think you called it. We're inside your head. I happened to be looking in on you and Gwen when that horrid monster possessed you. I followed you to Galvin Prime to see if there was anything I could do, and look at that there was. She smiled as Jen sat down on a rock. But does that mean I won't have Ghost Freak anymore? Verdona shook her head. No, darling. The DNA is still in your little Omnitrix, but I stripped Zascare's consciousness from it, and she can't hurt you anymore. Not where she is. Jen nodded and scrubbed at her face. She stood from her rock and hugged her grandmother. Verdona smiled and hugged her back. You have no idea how much better that makes me feel. Verdona smiled. Of course I do, Jennifer. I'm in your head. But that's not the point. We should talk about what just happened. She gestured around at the leftovers from Jen's nightmare. Only Kevin was left behind, still a solid statue. Jen closed her eyes. Do I have to? Verdona shook her head. I suppose not. But Max always found it helpful. It would just be between us. We are alone in your head, after all. Jen sat back down on her rock. Not sure what you want me to say. Ghost Freak was using my friends to scare me. Verdona shook her head. She was using Gwen, certainly, but she's done that before, hasn't she? Images skipped through the water of the small cove like ripples from a stone. A much younger Gwen with bright purple eyes and black cracks in her face like a broken porcelain. Doll standing on the edge of a tall building. Jen shuddered. Gwen's so much more powerful now. I doubt an ectoneurite could even touch her. She has too much mana. It burns them like sunlight in quantities like the ones Anodites have. Jen scrubbed her face. You're sure? She sounded so young. Verdona nodded. I'm sure. Now, about Kevin. Jen glanced at the statue. It's my fault. His initial mutation, this new one. It's all because of the Omnitrix. Verdona shook her head as she watched the memories of Jen's first meeting with Kevin play out in the water. A snot-nosed little runaway, already far too charged for an Osmosian his age. He'd had power problems long before you came along. You and your cousin are two of the most powerful beings on Earth, and at the time your cousin's spark hadn't fully awoken. You gave him power he couldn't find anywhere else. An already twisted Osmosian wouldn't have been able to resist. And this latest mutation, she paused as she watched the memory, you can in no way blame yourself for. An assassin tries to kill you, nearly succeeds, and your single concern is for your friend? You really are Max's grandchild. Jen laughed. Verdona tilted her chin up gently with a hand. You are bound and determined to fix this, and I admire that. But you can't hold the blame of worlds on your shoulders. You're a child. And I don't mean that in the sense that you aren't old enough. I mean that you shouldn't have to be in the position you are in. Let others help you from time to time. It will make you feel better. Jen laughed again and scrubbed her face. Verdona looked off into the distance. Now the boy. Ethan? Jen looked around, disappointed that he hadn't reappeared. She sighed and looked down at her hands, her eyes wandering to the watch, on her wrist, even here in her mind. Sometimes I think I might be a bit too much for him. Verdona scoffed. If he can't handle the spectacular being that is my granddaughter, he isn't worthy of your time. Jen smiled at Verdona. Thanks, Grandma. She hugged the young human. I'll see you outside, she said and swooped out of Jen's mind with ease.